What's going on, world? It's your boy, the author. Right back at that ass again. Here's another one. I just want to make this video, man. I came across some information I wanted to share with you guys, man. I'm just going to kick it off, man. First things first, man. I'm just wondering, why is it that white people, or at least this country, doesn't like to speak about white slavery? I was thinking about that, man, because growing up, I mean, even now, the most recent slave movie, which was entitled 12 Years a Slave, multiple awards were given out for that movie. It was similar to and that movie, I think it's about maybe, what, 2 or 3 years old. I didn't bother to see it. I didn't want to see it. It reminded me of Roots. Same thing with the Kunta Kinte, so on and so forth. Every slave movie where it shows blacks or colored people as slaves gets rave reviews. Everyone involved gets an Oscar or an Oscar nomination. Same thing with, I think, the Alex Haley and the Roots. Then they had a Nat Turner rebellion. We're taught in school that blacks were slaves, or quote unquote African Americans were slaves, and that's pretty much all the history you're taught in inner city schools. Which is why it's a debate as to why many think that blacks should, educate their own children. But you're taught in school. I was taught in schools about slavery and blacks being slaves, and then came Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement, yada yada, so on and so forth. But I've never seen a movie where white people were enslaved by brown complected people. Never. I've never seen a movie like that. Sometimes I think racism can be perpetuated in a way where it's in the story they tell, meaning it can be confused in the story that's told to you, but even more racism can be inflicted upon you by details that were omitted about the story. I repeat, details that were omitted can have an even more powerful impact on you than quote unquote details that were given to you. Um, and I have a great example, man, and this is a great example of that, where every time they mention the word slavery, or if there's a slave movie, or if there's a slavery lesson in schools, it always involved people of my complexion who were enslaved by quote unquote Europeans or Americans and things of that nature. Um, but you never hear about white slavery. You just don't. I've never seen a movie where I've seen white people enslaved. I've never read in a book. They don't teach you in school about white people being enslaved ever. I haven't been taught that. I haven't seen that in any textbooks that were given to me. As of recent, from doing my own research, I found out that white people were slaves for a long period of time, man. Throughout history. As a matter of fact, I think I was just doing some research on white slavery, where, for example, between the 16th century, I think the 16th through the 18th century, um, white people were taken, and they said there were pirates from Africa who had ships, and they brought them to, and I think they're mostly probably Islam, but these people came from Africa, from where was the places I wrote down the places, Morocco, Algeria, Libya. Hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. But they came on ships to Europe. They took white slaves from Spain, Italy, France. Where else? Spain, Portugal, Italy, France, England, the Netherlands. Men, women, and children took them from Europe and brought them over to Morocco and Libya and sold them, man. They said, I think between 1.25 million in total between, I think 2 to 3 centuries where pretty much brown complected people. Now, I'm not saying all blacks are the same people. I'm not saying they were African Americans or so-called African Americans, but these were people from Africa. I'm assuming some of them had similar to my complexion or darker, who enslaved white people, men, women, and children. Brought them on ships, man. And they did this for about 300 years, man. And again, in between the 8th and the 15th century, the Moors, they enslaved, they're mostly Muslims, and they enslaved white Christians between the 8th and the 15th century. So for almost about 700 years, man, where they dominated Spain and a lot of the most powerful European countries. I think it was Spain and a few other countries that were pretty dominant during that time between the 8th and 15th century. And the and I guess that's what Shakespeare was talking about in his book when he wrote Othello. And because I used to always wonder why Othello was a black general, and of course Iago was one of Othello's one of the ship, the ship help, or one of the ship employees that worked for Othello, and he caused the whole fiasco, and he tricked Othello into thinking that Desdemona was cheating on him. But the black military general had affairs with the white lady, with the white girl. And I think that spoke to something a lot deeper. It was the white man's hatred for the fact that because I was wondering, why was Iago, what was his aim? Why did he do that in terms of tricking Othello into thinking Desdemona had cheated on him? And I think that had a bigger paradigm in terms of whites feeling that they hated the black general, because at that time, the time that Shakespeare was talking about, blacks ruled over whites. They had them as slaves, man. And so that's why Iago had that viciousness. Because I was thinking, like, why did he make Othello? And these plays were basically from the 1400s. The 1400s. Why did he make Othello into a general? And I was like, well, during that time, I thought we were slaves. That's all you hear is about blacks being slaves. And it's almost like if you go to some of the so-called Hebrew Israelites will tell you that blacks, or quote-unquote African Americans, have been slaves since the beginning of time, which is more bullshit. But yeah, I think that play kind of touched on that in terms of, whites being angry that the blacks did have whites under control. They had them in bondage, basically. They enslaved Spain, Portugal, and I think it was another country that the Moors had a tight control over. And then a lot of these Moors were brown complected individuals. Not to say that they were quote unquote African Americans, but they were. A lot of them did have pigmentation in their skin. Okay, and you can look at the region that they were from. That region still has brown complected people. Okay, and they took over white people, men, women, and children. So it was normal to see a black that was a general who had a white female. Almost equivalent to now, where you'll see like the white man being the captain in the USA, and today blacks being submissive to whites in terms of the hierarchy, where now it's more common to see a white male who's the captain of the ship, and she's in love, or he may be in love with the black female on board who may be beautiful, and how would the average black take that? But yeah, man. My point is, they never talk about Hollywood. Never talks about white slavery, and it's existed. They said it was normal during the Roman days. They had a lot of poor Italians were slaves. And I just think all these movies where they make every movie that whenever they talk about slavery, or whenever they say there's a slavery movie being made, you can almost bet that the narrative will include whites being the slave masters and blacks being the slaves, or copper colored people, or people of my complexion, or quote unquote African Americans. And I always like to stress that term because I don't like the term African Americans, but that's just to let the viewer know who I'm referring to. It always comes across as, my people being slaves. And I think it's just a way to, embarrass black people, one. Two, to systematically make black people think that their only place is as a slave, that we've always been slaves, and that we've had no other place in history. We were never rulers, and not only that, but people of brown complexion have never ruled over people of lighter hue. And that's just a falsehood, man. And you have very few whites that ever, I don't know if every white even knows about their history in terms of that. Because, whenever you hear a white person who may admit that their people were slaves, it'll usually be some white person who's Irish, and he'll talk about, the people from England enslaved my ancestors, if he's Irish, meaning, the English enslaved the Irish, which is true. And you had the potato famine, the potato famine, and white Irish were made into slaves and things of that nature, and they endured some of the same beatings as black slaves. But they never, and that's as far as you'll hear, so we were slaves too. But you'll never hear about, they'll never tell you, I don't know if other white people don't know, or if they aren't aware, but they'll never tell you that it was dark complected people who it wasn't only the Irish who were slaves to the English. It wasn't just white on white slavery, but in fact, people from Italy, France, Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands were taken from Europe and made slaves in Africa by brown and black complected people. They'll never tell you. They'll never talk about. I've never heard one white person talk about that. Even a few white people who will admit that their people were slaves, they will never admit that their people were enslaved and brought to Africa on ships by other blacks. They will never. I've never heard. I've met a lot of white people throughout my 40 years on the planet. I've never heard of another white person say that, or would be willing to admit to that. I've never seen a movie that showed a person of my complexion enslaving white people at all, let alone bringing them to another land to do servitude. Never seen it. You know what I'm saying? So it's crazy. It's not talked about. It wasn't presented to me when I was in high school and or middle school or elementary school. In any of the books I read, no one ever talked about whites being enslaved by blacks, or what you would call black people. Even though a lot of the blacks during that time, the Moors were considered Muslim, and they'll say, well, they're Muslim. But that's not white on white. The Moors during that time were dark complected people, and they enslaved white people, and have been doing this for 700 years, not the 400, 700 years. And I know Islam, they had slaves for 1,300 years. And not all, and some of their slaves were black, other blacks, and a lot of their slaves were whites. And they were saying how, like, during the Ottoman Empire, a lot of the white females were whored out, man, made into sex slaves. They not only trafficked white men, women, and children, but a lot of the white females were made into sex slaves. You know, but I mean, I've never seen a movie in the U.S. that showed brown complected people enslaving white people. So to me, man, when you admit that part of history that's out there, that's easily Googled, that's racism right there. You admit that. So why would you omit that? And like I said, the only time I've heard a white person talk about slavery, it's on 2 or 3 occasions. It's always the Irish saying that the England enslaved them. They will never talk about how either they don't know or they don't want to talk about. They'll never talk about how Africans enslaved some of the most powerful, what we know today is some of the most powerful European nations in the world. Africans enslaved England, Italy, Spain, France, the Netherlands, and took those people, 1.25 million, over to Africa for servitude. Like, they will never speak about that. I don't know if it's just a white pride thing, or maybe they just don't know. But as far as I've heard a white person go, the ones who will talk about where we were slaves too, they will mention about the Irish versus England having the Irish, because that's more white on white. So that doesn't take away so much pride. When you look at the people that you have in that, people today, where blacks are looked at today as being, submissive and being victims. I guess it's too hard for them to admit that people of my hue once had their ancestors in bondage, man, and enslaved the men, women, and children. Just like when they so-called had us on ships and brought us over, which I don't totally believe. But just like the same thing with us, like when they brought Africans to America, whites were brought to Africa, made to be slaves as well. You know what I'm saying? But I never have heard about this. I had to look this up myself. So, I mean, it's a weird thing, man, but I think that's part of the mental brainwashing to make you think that, because, when you know this, you tend to look at slavery from a different perspective. First, you don't look at white supremacy as the overall flawless God, like we're supposed to, like you hear some of these people, like, the Neely Fullers and some of these authors, they talk about white supremacy being the most powerful force in the universe. You start to see holes in that armor when you know all of that, what happened. You start to see, oh, okay, maybe the white supremacy, because back when the white Europeans were brought to Africa for servitude, it was more like a Muslim versus Christian thing. But a lot of your Muslims were darker complected people. A lot of your Christians were white people. But to see the whole thing in perspective, to see that, oh, wait a minute, whites were enslaved by blacks as well. You started to see that there's a hole in that white supremacist knowledge of thinking. Not to say that white supremacy doesn't exist today and that it doesn't have a strong hold on the planet, and that it doesn't control a lot of what goes on in terms of the major areas of productivity, with education, economics, sex, religion, things of that nature. Now, it's not to say it doesn't have that stronghold in those areas, but it does show that it is not flawless, and it hasn't been the the flawless force that's existed through, because before, I mean, as a kid, by seeing blacks being slaves in every movie, I was thinking, well, white people have probably been the masters of the universe since the Ice Age. And blacks have just been slaves since the beginning of time. And that's just the way things are supposed to be. That's what they put. That's part of that brainwashing that they do. That's the kind of brainwashing that can cause. And Stockholm syndrome can set in very, very strongly as well through that type of thinking. But when you sit in hindsight and say, "Oh, okay, they were slaves too, by people who look like me, with the wide noses." Not saying they were my people, so to speak, but they were enslaved by brown complected people, all of Europe, and a large number of whites were enslaved. Then you look at it as, so maybe it's just your turn now. So it is possible for people of my hue to be on top and to enslave you. It changes the dynamic. You're not looked at as, oh, my only place on the planet is to be of service to you. So to speak. My people have always been slaves, etc., etc. And that's what they try to teach through that Christian Bible, which I can see why Japan and China have all outlawed Christianity, because they know about this powerful brainwashing techniques, and they've seen what Christianity has done to the black race. But I just thought I'd share that with you guys, man. Let me know what you think. If you've seen a movie where you've seen brown complected people enslave white people, like I said, if it is out there, it's not a blockbuster. It was made with a low budget, and only a few people was able to see it. I've never heard of it. I've never seen it. It may be an old movie, but if you know of a movie out there that shows white bondage, let me know about it. Make sure to like, subscribe, give me a comment. But hey, what's your opinion? Why do you think that Hollywood never talks about white slavery? All right. Until later, you guys take care.